Well, hi everyone. I think we'll give a couple of minutes for people to sign in and then we'll start.
Marian, if it would be helpful, I can head over to the Teams meeting and give folks the link.
That'd be great. Thank you, Trisha. I was trying to do that and I
All
can't.
right.
I can't
Okay, see you in a minute.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was trying to do that too. Okay. Okay, one more minute. We'll start it. Okay. So it's 1:02 now. Thank you everybody who was able to make it today. Ashley, can you advance the slides, please? So welcome again. Again, a note about using the chat. Please introduce yourself, name and affiliation in the chat, and we'll use the chat also for technical issues and for links that you want to provide for everybody. And we can continue to have conversation in the chat, but it would really be best if you have something to say to open your mic and join the conversation. Okay, that's all. Thank you. And I will hand it over now to Chris.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So we met as a group on 8/16. We can go to the next slide to discuss the pros and cons of some of the sites that we looked at and others. And it put it together on a whiteboard. It was a really productive discussion and gave the work group that did this mock-up of the risk assessment site, which I'll show later, a lot of information. We weren't able to incorporate every single one of these sticky notes in this mock-up, but this was really helpful to us to figure out what's important. And so I'll leave it to you all to look at these pros and cons on the box site later, because it's too much to go into, but it was very helpful. And then we had another question about the sites, which is what did you want to include on the sites? Again, really helpful conversation that helped guide and will continue to help guide the design of the site itself. So thank you for that.
Chris,
yes.
Can you turn on your video when you're talking?
Oh, yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And as we move along, I'm probably going to be using this whiteboard feature again, because it was really helpful in spurring on conversation and getting people to think about things. We also requested that folks read a paper by Esri called Creating Composite Indices Using ArcGIS. And the Esri produced this paper because they have a new feature in ArcGIS Pro 3.1 that allows users to create indexes. And so they're wanting to tell people how to use this feature. But it did provide a lot of background information about indexes. And so even if we don't use the ArcGIS indexing feature, the information in that paper can be really helpful in helping us settle on a common language and understand some of the techniques used to build a risk assessment and to assemble information and data into some sort of information. So at this point, I'd like to ask, did anyone have any questions, concerns, insights, thoughts about this ArcGIS paper, Esri paper, or about the whiteboard exercise? Nothing? Okay, so this paper will be put in box along with a couple of others that I'm reviewing now about assembling data into information. Okay, so the other activity that took place since the last meeting is that our survey closed, and we are in the process of analyzing it. We actually have analyzed quite a lot of it. It was very helpful. And again, the information collected during that survey will inform our ultimate product in a big way. So I'm going to turn it over to Tricia, who did much of the analyzing, to tell us what we found, or to share what we found.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So the survey subgroup, we met 4 times. We crafted, edited questions, formed them as a group. The survey was emailed out on August 14th and it closed on August 25th. It went to just over 1,000 people and 3 listservs. And then I did a little bit of analysis with the Excel data, with the raw data. So you can click. There you go. We asked 12 questions and we won't go in order, but there was an interesting mix of responses. We targeted it towards emergency managers, planners, GIS specialists, public health specialists. And while we didn't capture everybody that we necessarily wanted to capture, we were looking for city, county, special districts, tribes, universities, researchers, private consultants, and we mostly had responses from emergency managers, 14% of respondents. Most of those worked for counties, planners, 16% of respondents, and most of those worked for cities. GIS specialists were the next highest response category, and most of them worked for cities as well. And then a few public health specialists. And then we had 7% of respondents said that they were other. And they identified as city managers, city recorders, just one district engineer. So kind of concentrated in those 3 categories. And you can go to the next slide. The geographic representation was okay. Regions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So that's the Oregon coast, the North Willamette Valley, Mid and Southern Willamette Valley, Southwest Oregon, and Central Oregon. You can go to the next slide. And one of the top questions that we asked is which hazards do you evaluate? We asked specifically, where is it? Oh, I'm trying to find the exact question. But we asked them to select the hazards that they evaluate in their work, and wildfires and riverine flooding stood out. You can go to the next one. We also asked what tools they use, and very clearly census data and PSU's Population Research Center data really stood out, but also the Social Vulnerability Index from the CDC. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. This question, which assets do end users evaluate? This was relating to the required assets that we have to evaluate. So the question was, to meet FEMA's risk assessment requirements, we must include state and local critical facilities, buildings, infrastructure, and community lifeline components or subcomponents. For our purposes, these assets also include tribal critical facilities, buildings, infrastructure, and community lifelines. These are the assets we are considering including. For each one, please select one of the following statements. The data are available and I evaluate risk. The data, oh, how many responded? We had an N of 166 at the last, which is about 10%. So pretty standard for a survey. The data are available and I don't evaluate risk to this asset. The data aren't available, but I would evaluate risk to this asset if the data were available. And from a high level overview, water infrastructure, hospitals, transportation infrastructure, and residential housing, those were the top evaluated assets that the data are available, and the respondent does evaluate risk to those assets. Other top assets are emergency response facilities such as police stations, fire stations, and emergency response centers. And one area that this is high level, but one area that was interesting to me was seeing assets where the data are available, but they don't evaluate risk to the asset. That's an area that I think we still need to explore. You can go to the next slide. Then there was an open-ended option attached to this question where respondents could fill in, other assets. And there was some, interesting responses. Reservoirs and dams, shelters, childcare facilities, assisted living facilities, emergency medical services, which in some areas are not included with fire, the Bonneville Power Administration, transmission substations, just really interesting other assets that they had the data and did evaluate risks to these assets. You can go next. And then other assets, these are optional assets. This question was, there are other assets we are considering including beyond FEMA's requirements. For our purposes, these also include tribal assets. For each one, please select the following statement. The data are available and I evaluate, so on and on. The same format, but these are optional. And we found that schools, warming and cooling centers, mobile home parks, and libraries are the top assets that end users had data for and did evaluate risk. And other optional assets included public health facilities, the number of community-based organizations with that they assess risk for, and elder care facilities. So I thought that was really interesting. We can go to the next one. And then again, there was an open-ended option of other assets that could be considered in the creation of this risk assessment tool. So wetlands and flood attenuation areas, rental and owner occupied properties. So housing tenure, senior centers, multicultural centers, natural resources along the ocean front. Again, just really interesting assets that end users identified that they had and that they do assess risk for. So next. Abilities. This one was a really interesting question as well. So abilities, how did we? What? This question was, what attributes, features, and functions would enhance your natural hazards vulnerability and risk assessment? Please rank below elements on the basis of their importance to your work. So this was like ranked choice. The number one ranked first was upload and manipulate your own data set, upload and manipulate data from other sites. Weighting came in third, evaluating the effects of different hazard event scenarios, adjusting the scale is always important, and then save my work, return later, download and save output. Those were 6th and 7th. I think people assumed, of course, that will, that's not number one. It will probably be built in. And then the next one, you can go to the next one, I thought was really interesting. So this is the open-ended option of what other abilities would enhance your work. What's missing here? What do you think is missing? And this is just some of the more interesting suggestions. Making sure final products are understandable by the public. So conveying technical information to a non-technical audience, always important. A system that acknowledges and addresses compounding and cascading hazards impacts. That one's tricky, but good to know that folks were interested in that. And then the final one, the tool being an authoritative tool for landowners, buyers, and geologists to gather risks for a property. That I thought was a really important insight, and is something that maybe we should talk about whether this can be authoritative. So you can go to the next slide. Then this one, which features and functions. This question was, well, it was, I'm trying to find it. It was about which features and functions of the tool would be most important. I know, right? Landowners, buyers, and geologists would be most important to your work assessing risk. And again, it was a ranked choice. So coming in first was the ability for the system to generate text, maps, reports, graphs, charts, give an output. That the system would contain all of the necessary information about the hazards I need to evaluate, of course. That the system considers and provides demographic data, including indicators of social vulnerability. That came in third. Fourth was that the system would provide an analysis of how climate change affects natural hazards, which I expected right there in the middle. Fifth is that the system provides information about the natural environment. Sixth is about the built environment. And then 7th is that the system clearly identifies and provides data. So it attributes where the data comes from. And I think, again, like this was last, people probably assumed, of course, that will be included. That's bottom of my list. And then you can go to the next. And then that's
back. Excuse me, this is Marion. Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Yeah, I think 7 is we might have a typo there, that the system clearly identifies and provides sources for its data.
Right. Exactly.
Let's see what the option. I can change that. Thanks. That's a good catch, Marion.
Okay.
And you know, I don't think, let's go back to that for a minute. This is Chris. Most of the risk assessment sites I looked at do not provide direct links to their sources of data. So I think it's interesting that that was seventh, and it's one of my objectives. So I'm glad to see people felt that that was important. So before we go on to the next section, let's have a quick discussion about the survey results and hear what folks think about what we gathered. Were there any surprises, confirmation, just thoughts?
You can
Anyone?
just unmute and speak.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know if there were any population studies outside of PSU that came up repeatedly. I'm a little concerned that there's one source that all counties and agencies are primarily using.
No, no other population studies were mentioned, but I think that is more of a survey design issue and not necessarily that there aren't other population studies.
Well,
It's just
census,
that was the only option.
the census did come up and was selected by
Yes.
most participants.
The census
So-
was the most highly selected.
Mhm.
I think it seems like PSU though has the one has the most referenced forecasting, whereas the census is sort of existing data.
Yeah.
Okay, great. No, thank you.
The state actually funds um, PSU to the Population Data Center to provide that information for the local governments and for the state agencies. And so that is it's probably one of their primary data sources.
Marion, I thought
Gotcha,
it,
that makes sense.
I thought it was the data source and they're just pulling extra data out of it and packaging it differently.
I'm not sure who's they
Issue
is pulling data.
out of the community surveys associated with the census and extending that data to a finer scale and more attributes and things like that. I think they're one and the same. Now, you know, are other people doing similar things with the community survey data? I don't know. And should they? Don't know. We're lucky to have anything, right?
Yeah, PSU does draw heavily from census, but they also do forecasting and try to, for the cities anyway, for population growth projections. So yeah, the census and PSU, they're very closely linked. So this is Chris. One of the parts or responses I found particularly interesting was the one about the real estate agents. And can we go back to that slide? This one, authoritative tool for landowners, buyers, and geologists. I think we need to talk about that because well, I'm not sure that this system is aimed at that particular user group. So I think we need to talk about how we describe who we are targeting as our users, and that we have appropriate disclaimers for people who are looking for property specific information, and to be really careful not to how can I say this, over display so that people can't maybe zoom into their own properties, because the system is not really designed to do that. But that's an area that I think we need to pay attention to. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not crazy about this, but one possibility is to explain why using the information to make projections for a property is generally not going to be supported by the data sources.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so explaining that, you know, that the projections on which the hazards are based generally are, you know, sort of the finest reasonable resolution is XYZ, that yes, that resolution includes particular properties, but the data sources just are not designed to try to make projections at that fine of a level.
Right.
And so explaining why, I mean, people can still do it if they want, but but being upfront about this is not an advisable use, and this is why.
Yeah, limitations, yeah. And not an advisable use, yes.
Yeah, Marianne here. I totally agree with what's been said before. When I read that, it made me kind of nervous.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I hear, I do a lot of community outreach and kind of conversations, and it seems like people think data is more accurate than it actually is. So like people don't often think, or it seems like sometimes people don't think about uncertainties and that these are actually estimates. They're not specific measures often, you know, especially if models are involved. So I think your comments about disclaimers is really on point, but they need to be really clear disclaimers so that people actually read them. But it's tricky, I think.
Yeah. Kevin?
Hi, so I'm with our Parks and Rec and the Ocean Shore program, and we deal a lot with kind of the interface between the coastal hazards. And back in '94, there was actually a coastal hazards work group that had met and made some specific recommendations for things like the actual basically real estate disclosure side of things. And I think this type of tool, you know, not only being able to show that, but being able to actually help provide some support, even on a general level. What we see is a lot of people, for example, buy oceanfront property and have no clue about the risks that they're getting engaged with of having oceanfront property, and just being able to bring that to the forefront and having that, you know, even on a advisory level, I think would move us way ahead. I mean, again, the amount of people I interact with that don't even recognize tsunamis are an issue, and they have oceanfront property or that coastal erosion, or their house is on a chronic hazard area. I mean, they don't know. And, you know, then they're stuck with a piece of property that they want to do something with, and those hazards, and they had no idea. So like I said, I think it's more that it does not that you have to be very specific, but just giving them the, hey, this might be a high risk property, you might want to do your due diligence is where I could see this tool coming in.
Right. Okay. Any other comments about the survey? Yeah, so the next steps with the survey are to organize the information in a way that we can make sure in the design subgroup that we're ticking the boxes, that we're and if we can't address something, that we explain why. And it might be a limitation of the data, or a limitation of our capacity, or something else.
I also want to. Oh,
sorry,
go ahead.
I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to say something real quick that was kind of, I don't know, I was sort of waffling on if I should even bring it up or not, but in the previous slide, there's, I think it's like number 6 or number 5 or 6, addressing the natural environment. I was just wondering, like, because in my mind, you know, like doing a risk assessment, oftentimes I'm just thinking about the built environment, and
yes,
you know, the natural environment, I guess I'm thinking things like wetlands and forests, things like that. Are we addressing that with climate change, or how else would we address the natural environment?
Matt, that is a great question and very much unresolved.
Okay.
It's one of those, it's possibly an area that we will not be able to address right away because it's something we haven't done before. And it could be, we'll have to think about that, whether we can address that at all in this first go round.
Okay, thanks.
That raised a question. I was wondering, will this tool be able to provide like baselines and then change over time?
That's a great suggestion. I'm writing that down because I think that's something we need to think about.
Yeah, Marianne, this is Marianne. That's something that we do need to address in our natural hazards mitigation plan. And we have a baseline for actual use of property. We probably won't be able in time, but we might. The discussion is going on now, or it just got started actually. It's been something that we've been hobbled by in the past because we really haven't had the baseline. So we will be looking at changes in development, which is FEMA defines extremely broadly, which is everything from built environment to population movements and demographics. What we have is actual property use as a baseline. The basic question is, are we increasing our vulnerabilities or decreasing them over time?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just beginning to be able to start answering some of those questions. And so I like your suggestion for getting this into this tool. And I'm not quite sure how much we're going to be able to do this time.
Great. Okay, if there are no other questions about the survey, we can go into the design subgroup. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to tell folks what happened. The design subgroup was a subgroup of this work group. There were 6 or 8 people that were able to participate in the design subgroup. We met twice, and we talked about ways and approaches to address what we saw in the preliminary survey results, because they weren't out when we met fully, and also in the whiteboard exercise. So we batted around a bunch of ideas during those 2 meetings, and then I took that information back to my desk and tried to synthesize a very high level approach. So that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so the first assumption that we agreed upon is that the system will address each part of the risk equation. And the risk equation being the hazard, the presence of a hazard or presence of an event that can cause a hazard, exposure, who and what is exposed, what are the consequences of that exposure, and then what coping capacities or measures have been taken to reduce the consequences of that exposure. So the risk equation, it's very well documented and supported in the literature is exposure to the hazard times vulnerability divided by the coping capacity is what causes risk of harm. So I thought about that equation in those 4 boxes and how we would integrate information across those 4 boxes to do the risk assessment. So my thought was that points could be assigned within each of these boxes that move through the system. And the points would be assigned using a set of rules that the system in the background would use to calculate stuff. So that's kind of the basic idea of what I'm going to talk about next. So what do I mean by points? So we can go to the next one. So this is an example or rules and points. So in the flood world, we have certain, we know certain things. We know that some places are very unlikely to flood. We know that some of them are not in the FEMA flood zone, but they're very close to a water course. We know that there's a mapped 500-year flood zone and there's a mapped 100-year flood zone. Or we know that the floodway is mapped in many areas, which is the most dangerous part of the flood zone. We know that some buildings are constructed to flood standards and others aren't because of their age of or year of construction. And then we also know that there are cascading effects. Now, I haven't, whoops, sorry, I just wiped myself out here. We haven't talked about this scoring rubric as a group, but I just wanted to point out that this is what I mean by rules and points. So for when we talk about exposure, then we can count the number of assets or people or whatever we're counting within our study areas and apply those rules and make conclusions that, for example, 30% of buildings in this, say, census tract score 4 or more above for flood. So that's very, very high level. The math is not like settled, okay? I have another example, and this comes from Dogami's HazView site where they have landslide potential listed on a map. And so those landslide potential rules could also be assigned points and move through the system. So one of the challenges is that some of these categories of hazard or exposure would have a lot more levels of points, just because there's more going on, and some would maybe be just have 1 or 2, a yes or a no. So the question is, if there are different levels of analysis or levels of concern, high, medium, low, or just medium and high, or whatever, is that a de facto weighting? And so how do we deal with that? One of the big questions we'll have to figure out. And then I have another example of rules that would apply to, say, people. So does this hazard have the potential to result in casualties? A lot of them, a few of them. So I think there's a typo in there. That +1 should be a 4. Anyway, so this is what I mean by rule, that the system would assign points or scores to a set of rules that then those point values would move through the system into the final risk equation. Any thoughts about that so far? So in a lot of risk assessments, they use categories of high, medium, and low, or high, medium, low, negligible, whatever. well, somewhere in that calculation, they've translated that English into an equation, and that's basically what this is doing.
Are you envisioning somehow a capacity to deal with, and I think this came up in the comments, cumulative effects? So you might have several moderate impact events that, if collectively, if they happen within a particular time frame, adds up to overwhelming a system.
Yes, I am thinking about that. I haven't come up with a way to do it, but I'm reading some really interesting stuff now, but that's one of my intentions, to see if I can get there. So let's go to the next slide, and maybe that will help answer that question. So I took that concept with the risk equation and thought about it in terms of a dashboard that a user would go to. And I'm calling it the Oregon Natural Hazard and Climate Change Risk Calculator. If anyone has a better name for it, please tell me about it. One of the comments that we got in the group discussion was that it's really helpful to have a navigation bar that's always there, that always takes you home. It's consistent, so I put that in there. The other comment we got was that it's really nice to have instructions right there on the front page, so that people know what they're supposed to be doing and they don't have to go searching for some user manual. So the idea is that a user would come to a site like this, similar to this, and specify the parameters that they want evaluated within each of these parts of the risk equation. And I'll show you that in a second. But once they've specified all that stuff and they come back to this, they've got their whole model set up that the system is facilitating. They click the green button, calculate risk, and get a report out that integrates all the information that they've specified. So if we go to the next slide, I'm thinking this is kind of a very rough mock-up of what I mean by what's behind one of those blue boxes, and this being the natural hazard and climate dashboard. And so a user would select which hazards they want to evaluate. They would specify whether they want the system to include climate change in the report. They would specify the study area that they're interested in. And then possibly select by selecting it on a map, but it'd be easier for the system if it were just state, county, or city, or tribal area, or something like that. We did hear pretty strong desire to have the ability to add your own data. So I put the green box in there for that purpose. I don't know how to do that yet. And then also a way to save the information that you put in as you're selecting parameters, so you don't have to go through the whole exercise in one sitting. So all these things on here are kind of placeholders, but I'm trying to give a sense of what I mean by the user selects parameters that are specific to that part of the risk equation. And it could be that this parameter selection is several layers deep, and it would vary for each of the different hazards. So then after they select all their parameters and hit that calculate button, they get a risk report, which would include a map, text report with source citations, charts, graphs, all the stuff that we folks requested be in a report. And the report would be populated with information calculated by the system, along with a bunch of boilerplate to explain what it means, and then output into a report that the user could edit and include in their natural hazard mitigation plan or other risk tool that they're using. So that is a very high level overview of how how I personally integrated the information that was talked about over the course of these meetings and our work group, risk work group, subgroup meetings. So nothing is undiscussable. This is up for discussion, improvement, throw it out the window, start over, whatever. So that's really the main purpose of the meeting today is to think about what I didn't think about and offer suggestions. So I see Paul's hand is up.
Yeah. So my question, I'm trying to integrate what you're saying with the risk assessments we have for the federal infrastructure that we manage, specifically like the 13, let's say the 13 dams in the Willamette Valley, for example.
Okay.
Each of them have a risk rating, and we evaluate risk differently, but sort of calculus, right? So, and I saw that you had Bill Burn stuff. So I guess how would you integrate that into what you're saying here? And is there a feedback loop with when things change, it gets fed into this? Like how would that interaction work? I'm just kind of seeing how I, the federal partner could say, all right, well, how do I integrate with this? Like what would be my integration?
So let's go back to the slide that has the mock-up of the site. That one. So I'm thinking that the assets, people, livestock, crops, built environment, infrastructure would be examined in this exposure dashboard. So the dam, would the dam be a hazard or an exposed asset? I don't know. We'd have to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, my gut feeling is exposed asset.
That's funny, Paul, because I was thinking differently. I was thinking the other way, that that it would be a hazard. First of all, it's treated as a hazard in the state NHMP, but that it would be a hazard. Well, yeah, maybe you're right, that it would be the exposure and the sensitivity would be the vulnerability, the exposure of other folks to the breach of a dam. I don't know. It could be I see where you could do it both ways, where it would be a hazard and the sensitivity would be the people exposed and the property exposed and the natural environment exposed. But it could also be the exposure of the dam itself to something like a landslide or an earthquake or something like that.
That's kind of, I was thinking earthquake, like, the damage to the infrastructure there. And that's where my head was going.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. These are exactly the kind of things we have to figure out. That one of my key aspirations, I guess, for this site is I don't want it to be super complicated for the user. I want us to be able to figure out these things in the background so that the users aren't overwhelmed with these kinds of decisions. So yes, we'll talk about how to integrate that federal dam stuff into a system like this, if we can. All right, Marianne.
Yeah, I'm curious about that box where you check the include climate change.
Yeah, yeah.
So that kind of mystifies me.
Okay, so I put that in there because I was thinking that some of these hazards are climate related and some aren't. And my thought process there was that the user might want to look at hazards as in the past using existing data, and they might want to compare it to what the future holds in climate change. So this, if you check that box, the system would do both. It would tell you what the historic patterns have been, and then it would tell you what the future projections are. But it would be
So
happening
maybe-
in the background.
Okay. So, because I always think of climate change as a threat multiplier, right? So you don't have any of these climate change. I mean, they combine, and so maybe relabel that to say add climate projections, or
Yeah.
I don't, because it makes like you can just remove climate change, like, oh, that's not going to happen. We can check the box, and it, you know, it just seems odd to me somehow, that and
Yeah.
confusing.
I'll just second that as well. I was confused by that too. If the
Okay.
yeah, just if the risk assessment is going to be forward looking, I could see range. I could see building that up to, you know, climate projection variables, but it does seem all of this is prone to you know, or is trying to assess that risk going forward rather than considering any of it to be stationary based on the past. Whether, you know, whatever political or ideological views people have, the current trends are what they are.
Well, what if it was just done by default? They didn't have to check anything. So
Yeah,
the final report would
make
show
sense.
would show what we saw in the past and how we expect it to change in, say, 20 years or 50 years, or maybe both. That could be an option.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Oh,
And I think there is big value too in that sort of I think often jurisdictions tend to plan through the average or minimal risk, but valuable to maybe check a box and say, okay, you know, what are the worst case projections that we might want to get at?
yeah. Maybe we can do that. Is it in a scenario sort of building way?
That's what
Yeah,
I
so
thought the
I think
box
that's-
represented was which emission scenario.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so
Which one?
Excuse me for 1 second, Robert,
Yeah.
and anybody else who hasn't done this, please put your name, title, and affiliation, if any, in the chat. Thank you.
so I see Kevin's hand up, and then Robert.
Yeah, I had two things. One, I was just going to say on that climate change, one of the things that might make it, I'll say, challenging is, you know, for example, looking at NOAA's, their sea level rise tool, where it has a sliding scale from like 1 to 10 feet, which kind of covers the full broad range.
Yeah.
You know, some of those might be challenging when you start dealing with multiple hazards, but that, I guess, that kind of brings back, you know, maybe looking at how some of the other resources out there take those into account, because some are going to be more projection based and some are going to be potential scenario based, and we are getting better data like our sea level rise maps and some of those that are coming out, which have more of the, I'll say, normal prediction, or more of the most likely scenarios. But anyways, the other consideration or question I wanted to throw out there was, how is this going to be tied into updates? Because some of these are fairly static, as far as, you know, they just, you have the risk over time, but then others, like, and I'll just specifically talk on the coastal hazards, we've got chronic, I mean, it's changing every year, every season, after storms, whatever it is. So there can be significant changes, and there are, you know, ongoing ongoing efforts to update those maps and projections and the risks and the hazards. And so just thinking through that, since you've got some that are going to be more static and some that are going to be, you know, fairly dynamic, and how that system is going to be updated on a periodic to, you know, to accommodate the new research and, you know, and new data that comes in.
Yes, I have thought about that, and it kind of gets back to that baseline question as well. I do not want to get in the business of serving all this data on a site that DLCD has to maintain. My vision, don't know if it's a possible vision, but my vision is that most of this data would be taken, so the dynamic hazards where the things are updated every year or two would be updated at the source, and we would use a web mapping service to just draw them into the system. And other things, they don't change that often, so it would just so the issue with that, of course, is that the vintage of the data would be different across all these hazards. That's true today, but it makes it even more important to mention, what the vintage of the data is when you're in that report. But it also gets back to that baseline question. If you want to compare last year's report to this year's report, we need to have a way to save that information somehow. All right. I saw another hand. Was it was there someone else that wanted to say something?
I think it was Robert.
I think it was Robert, yeah. But his hand is down now.
I put it down after the climate change box. That was kind of what I was curious about too.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I have one, Chris. It says all material can be downloaded and edited by the user. What exactly would the user be editing? Because we wouldn't want a user editing something that the tool produces without identifying that.
Yes. So by editing, I was meaning that the information that's spit out could be formatted to the natural hazard mitigation plan format that they're using, or that they could add more text to explain, like a local nuance that they know about with respect to the data. But I wasn't thinking that the actual results would be editable.
Okay, thanks.
So maybe formatted is the better word to use there. Or rearrange, whatever. I just didn't want to spit it out into a format that nobody could manipulate. So maybe manipulate is the better word. So any other thoughts, arrows, slings? Am I on the right track? Does this seem like an approach that's worth continuing to develop?
I guess I had a question. So you develop this tool as envisioned, and you bring in all the data, and we update the natural hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. So I procedurally thinking, you would, in the course of, once you create it now, in the course of the 5 years until the next NHMP, I guess, would that onus on keeping it updated and be on DLCD manage that? So in the next NHMP update, you would just rely on this tool? Is that kind of the vision? And
yes, that's the big vision. Now, the big caveat is that we don't have a steady stream of money to do that.
Right.
But we're kicking that ball down the path and hoping that the tool will be seen as useful enough that it will continue to be funded. But that's true just about any tool you develop, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we're all on that, in that boat. I mean, like, there's so much information being outputted everywhere these days. That, yeah, I mean, we all face that in our jobs. That's
Yeah, so like I said, my idea is to try to make it as simple as possible for the user to specify what they want out of the system. So if they just want to look at flood, they can do that. It would not, in that case, satisfy the natural hazard mitigation plan, but it could satisfy some other need. But if they were using it to build a natural hazard mitigation plan, they would probably want to check all hazards. So the system would go through and try to identify and integrate risks from all of those hazards that are required by FEMA and whatever else they decide to add to this system. Like I said, the math on all this and the actual how this is going to be done hasn't been developed yet, or at least it's pretty sketchy. So there may be parts of this that are just not possible to execute.
And you're going down to, it looked like on one of the slides, you were going down to the county level and that's it? Or are you going down to the census tract, or how far down are you going?
Well, definitely the down to the city level. In
City
some
level, okay.
cases, that's really small. I don't know about going below that yet. Because remember, I'm thinking that this will be a tool to help build natural hazard mitigation plans. But then, of course, there's special districts, and they have different jurisdictional boundaries than a city or a county. So I'd have to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
I can almost envision on the updates when the NHMP's dated, there's like a FEMA-like discovery process where you start off seeing, since if there's any updates to this tool that are out there for the specific community you're looking at. I can almost see that process being built into the NHMP.
So you're saying have a function that says compared to 5 years ago, what's changed?
Well, I was just saying, like, if you said you didn't have any funding really to keep this up to date when created, I was saying, well, if it's built into the local NHMP updates, you could have like a discovery process where.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, and you kind of distribute the cost of upkeep to all the times that you're getting NHMP money to update.
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it is, Paul, and that's going to work into the vintage thing too, because they're not all updated on the same schedule. Yeah. I mean, 5 years, but when that 5 years begins and ends, it's different for most of the communities.
Right. But I like that idea. Just have a surcharge on every natural hazard mitigation plan, essentially, that pays to keep the system running. Eric.
Yeah, Chris. So is the issue that you're having or concerns that you're having with the weighting is just the relative risk to each hazard?
Yes, but there's probably a million more weighting issues in there.
That seems like a big one. That was going to be really, really interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah, I'm actually reading some really interesting papers about that now, which I will share with the group shortly after I've read them and made sure that they're actually useful. But yeah, there's a system called, I don't know how they pronounce it, Promethe, a multi-criteria decision analysis technique. Basically relies on matrices.
Can you send that out?
Of course I will, yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chris.
But like I said, I'm trying to read it and make sure there are several papers, and I want to make sure I'm sending the one that's most useful. But yeah, this is an interesting concept that's been being tried out in Europe. It's basically a matrix-based system. And that's kind of what I'm suggesting is a matrix-based system in the background that the users never see, but they just tell us what they want included in that matrix. And then in the background, there's all these calculations done. So Kevin, yes, census tracts would be useful for scaling. The other question that we have in thought process is, do we go with a polygon-based census tract system or a raster-based grid system? And there are pros and cons to both of those approaches, and maybe we can do both, maybe not. But that's one of the big design questions. Paul, do you have another question?
I'm sorry, I forgot to do that.
Okay. Looking for more hands. Anyone? So let's go back to the first slide in this group about the risk equation. And I'd like to get some consensus in the group that relying on the risk equation as an organizing principle seems like a reasonable approach.
I'm sorry to not raise my hand. I just had to drive somewhere quickly, so
It's okay.
hopefully that's all right. I think my only real concern with that is if it is too fixed, because often they, as a tool, that tends to be set in place and yeah, and just fixed over time, even as things change year to year or 5 years apart. If there aren't funds to update everything, say 5 or 10 years out.
So I'm not understanding what the concern is based on what. Are you thinking that the risk equation itself would change?
The point system, yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah, just simply the inputs and outputs, or the changing definitions, for instance, assets to risk factors, for instance.
Yeah, gotcha.
So.
But that's like a stage 2 concern. So the question I have right now is does it seem reasonable to use the risk equation as the sort of framework for this?
Are there alternatives? I mean,
well, no, actually. and I can share resources. Lots of review articles that go through all the different ways that people have tried to characterize risk, and it mostly all settles down to this one equation. And maybe it's just a lack of imagination on our parts, but I think that we can easily justify this as a framework in the literature, using literature, the research. So I think we'd have to, if we didn't use the risk equation as an organizing framework, we'd have to justify it.
Is there a possibility of incorporating other frameworks in tandem with this? I'm thinking of like the CRIDA framework, the climate risk informed decision analysis systems that the UN put out a while ago, and that are complementing similar things. My only concern would be having this be a fundamental framework in the same way that it's kind of always been used by others, but I feel like there are changing developments and enhancements to systems like this that may not be widely used yet, but that are more advanced and more accurate over time.
If you know of those systems, let me know.
Yeah, we'll do.
Yeah.
So I had one thing I was gonna say. I think that's
Uh-huh.
really, I think it's a valuable tool to use it that way. I'm just wondering, and again, part of this is going to come to the audiences, is that could some of the actual risks get hidden? I'll say the individual risks get hidden with some of the things like the consequence and the coping side. And I guess I say that from the standpoint of, you know, from a community level, from the natural hazards planning, that makes sense from that. Like, okay, what's the consequences of mass casualty or not? But then if there's, you know, and again, I'll reflect back on my program as the coastal. Well, if you've got a long stretch of beach that's high risk, high erosion, but yet really it's going to be affecting individual landowners, but it could, if it all unravels at one time, affect, you know, a long stretch of coast at one time. But on a ranking system, that might fall out fairly low, even though it's a high risk of failure, because it's individual landowners and that type of thing. And because they have armoring, does that coping, you know, buffer that down towards like, okay, now through that calculation, it appears there's limited risk, when in fact, really it's, you're on the Pacific Ocean, sea level rise, increasing storms, you're probably going to have a problem at some point in time. And, you know, and not every armoring structure is built the same to the same standards or will deal with this condition. So again, it's something that when it's being communicated out, and I think this is more of, again, the audience of the I'll say more of the landowner, more the individual level, that I think some of that could get hidden.
Yeah.
And so I guess I bring that up more as I think this is a really good backbone. It's just we've got to make sure that, you know, if we say, well, there's coping mechanisms in place, people will go, oh, good, I don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
And so, or it's not a mass casualty thing, whatever, it doesn't matter. So again, it's how do you not lose the actual realized risk versus maybe more the community risk, you know, and at that level. So anyways,
Yeah, you brought up a whole bunch of really good points. I'll start with one of them that we've talked about, and I don't know that we have a good resolution mathematically for, and that is the very low probability extreme consequence events. In most risk assessments, those get washed out. And we've been trying to figure out they get washed out when you're using it like a standardized way of looking at risks, such as this risk equation. It's something that we have to consider, is how we deal with those very low probability, very high consequence events as compared to a annual event like a flood or something.
Yeah, I think it's those bookends. It's the high probability with low consequence, or the low probability with high consequence. Because I mean, again, that same thing, you know, tsunamis.
Yeah.
How many of the oceanfront owners really understand that they're, you know, other than the blue line, which, you know, a lot of them don't even recognize what it means. You know, just those things where, again, how do you let somebody know that, you know, hey, this is a real problem out here. So again, it's more of just making sure that the outcome represents what we want it to show for the audiences that we're intending. And maybe that's part of it too, is, you know, on your checklist, maybe you ask, you know, who are you? If you're a government planner, then you use these things where it has more of the coping built into it, or you can turn the coping on and off, versus you know, hey, I'm a landowner, and it really, I hate to say it, it shows you more of the left-hand side, you know, and kind of more of what are your risks and what are your vulnerabilities, not, you know, not something that's buffered down. So again, just because, you know, even though we've got coping mechanisms, you're still at risk of flooding, you know, that type of thing. So again, just maybe there's a way of showing the same data a little bit differently for those audiences.
I really like that idea. And also the report boilerplate could be very different. So that the explanations in the final report, the graphs that are shown and so on could be very different depending on the audience.
Because yeah,
Or
I
how
mean,
the audience
if you haven't
identifies.
taken any emergency management or natural planning stuff, you may not have a clue what coping or some of these other
Yeah.
things mean. And you're
Yeah.
just like, I want to know what's going to happen to my house.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge that we're going to have to face is people will ask that question, and how do we address that human desire to know, you know, how is my thing at risk, or how am I at risk? Yeah. Maybe by not reporting by, only reporting by a certain scale, say census tract or neighborhood or something.
Hey, Chris, I have a question about the neighborhood
Yes.
thing because it keeps coming up in meetings. Is there a source for, I know that all cities have neighborhood boundaries in Oregon, or almost all. Is there a source for those? That's
I don't think
compiled? Because
there's an easy one to get
because
at.
I
No.
haven't seen one. I mean, that sounds like work for an intern to go to the 242 Oregon city websites and pull those.
Yeah, I'm guessing that only the larger cities actually have neighborhood boundaries. But yeah, no, I don't think that layer exists.
We could also ask the same question about unincorporated urban areas.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Something I was going through this in my head about, the equations, and I don't know, I may be off base here, but I'm not, and I don't know if this is a question or not, but the coping mechanism as a divider basically is that as it increases, the risk goes down. That seems to make logical sense. But then the utility of having a risk index with that as a divisor is such that your action items or your potentially funded projects are focused on those areas that don't have as much coping. And I guess maybe that's the bridge. I'm not sure I'm correct in my logic, but if that is correct, then you're sort of penalizing those who have a lot of coping or has been proactive in coping mechanisms, because they're not going to get funding or action items devoted to them. And I don't know, again, I don't know if that's right, or I'm just sort of going through that logic thinking in my head.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to think about. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't use the equation with the coping as being a divisor in this illustration, because I don't really know how we'd want to deal with that. I mean, it's commonly used as a divisor, but I'm not sure that for the reasons you cite, it's really useful. It might just be something that we want to report on separately in the risk report.
There also could be criteria. I think part of what we're going to do in the natural hazard mitigation plan is update our criteria for awarding FEMA funds to for projects and for planning. And so we have to we may want to think about that as we do that process, because I know that, and Joseph, jump in here if you have something else to say, but I'm pretty sure that OEM is thinking about geographic distribution of funding, and also funding small communities that really don't have any other capacity or capability, financial capability to do these things. So all of that needs to get taken into account, that if that we don't punish communities who are doing good things for having done them.
Yeah, we want to keep the momentum up, especially if they're highly populated areas.
So I'm just saying that one way to address that is through the criteria that we'll build in the NHMP. Maybe.
Right. That makes sense.
How are we doing on time, Ashley? Or Marion?
We're at 2:20, so we have 40 minutes left.
Okay. Do we want to take some public comment if there are people on the line at this time? So I don't really want to move. I want to make sure that people are comfortable with this moving forward in this way. We will have another risk subgroup to talk about this some more. And I have done more thinking about what's behind the boxes. So what do you think, Marion? Should we go into the discussion of the Declaration of Cooperation now or take public comment now?
I think we'll take public comment at the end.
Okay, then let's talk about the next steps. Okay, so for the next meeting, like I said, I will be sharing some approaches that have been used in Europe to address multi-hazard, multi-criteria risk analysis for natural hazards. I'm hoping that the subgroup of we can find a time for the subgroup of the design group to meet again and flesh this out a little bit more using the information that I share. But in addition, it's time to start thinking about the doing part of this. And this system will be require the efforts of everyone and in all agencies who rely on the state's natural hazard mitigation plan to provide information and expertise. So in order to facilitate that and to make it clear who has the resources and expertise to do what, we are proposing that each of the agencies that are participating in the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan update and this risk assessment upgrade, but particularly the upgrade for this, what I'm going to say next, sign a declaration of cooperation. The Declaration of Cooperation is a tool that's used by the Oregon Solutions, and it helps the project managers, us, DLCD, understand, like I said, who has what resources, and what commitments can be made to support the project. So the declaration of sample declaration of cooperation is on the box site. Is that true, Marion? Pretty sure it's true.
Yes, it's on the box site. It's attached to the, okay, so on the box site, it's under meeting materials.
Okay.
And there, I believe on the box site, let me check 1 second, I'm right there. Okay, on the box site, it's under meeting materials. There's the draft declaration of collaboration that we put together, and it's draft still. And then we have the Oregon Solutions example of the Declaration of Collaboration. So 2 separate documents. They were joined together behind the agenda on the website. So where it says agenda and meeting materials on the website, it's all in there. In Box, they're separate. And in Box, there are also those ledgers again for the GIS analysis tools like natural hazard loss data and the natural hazard related activity. So those are things that we can use as tools to get to what we want to put in the Declaration of Collaboration.
Right. So between now and the next meeting, we will be refining the boilerplate portion of that Declaration of Collaboration. And then we are wanting you to think about what you can contribute to this process. So I think that will be one of the primary subjects of the next meeting, is to start getting those declarations of cooperation crafted and answering questions and so on.
Chris, it looks like Paul has his hand up. I don't know if it's.
Yes. Paul, do you have a question?
No, I'm a poor meeting attender.
You're poor. Okay.
Sorry, it's just I'm on my phone with the Zoom and I just forgot to lower it. I'm sorry.
Gotcha. So Paul, you've actually had some experience with these declarations of cooperation or collaboration through Oregon Solutions, and does it work for your agency?
It's a little bit. What's the word? It's I would say it's novel for the Corps of Engineers to sign these, but it works. It does work because I don't know how to answer that. Yes, I probably can work this through my chain of command because we're military.
Yeah.
I think that it allows me to prioritize participation. It allows it kind of justifies my attendance and my participation in this. So I think that it's helpful for me to have that so that I can say with confidence that I'm participating because we signed this.
Yeah.
And if everybody understands why I'm doing it, then I don't have to fight that battle. So I think that's how I approach. Was that what you were asking?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Not everybody on the call has worked through an Oregon Solutions project before. And so generally they do these declarations of collaboration right about now after you've done a lot of scoping and talking, and now you're ready to do something. So that's where we are.
I think that the pinch point for me is how much do I commit my organization in decision making, and I think that's just I have to figure that out. I mean, that's just something I need to do. But I think that everybody would be facing the same thing: is how much are you committing your organization to some decisions or time?
Yes, exactly. And that information is really valuable to DLCD as we move through this project, so we know where we have gaps and who we can rely on for what. And then we can also figure out how to deal with those gaps where we have them within our budget. Okay. Any more questions about that and our next steps? So you can look forward to another doodle poll from me for the design subgroup to meet for our next meeting. I will post a couple of these research papers that I'm vetting now to the box site, and then we can move on from there. Okay. So now I'd like to invite members of the public to chime in and share your thoughts, concerns, suggestions. Do you have anyone that wants to say anything? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, then you get a half hour back. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you on September 27th.
Yes, and please, if anyone has anything they want to share with me before then, and please do so. Because like I said, what I shared today is very sketchy, and it's going to be fleshed out over the next few weeks, but any suggestions are more than welcome.
And September 27th is another Wednesday from 1 to 3.
Thanks, Chris.
Great, thank you. Thanks for coming.